Hey folks, my name is Jason Brian Santos, and I am the teaching elder and minister of Word and Sacrament at Community Presbyterian Church in Lake City, Colorado, a small mountain town of about 400 people in an 8,700-foot elevation, and actually in the most remote county in the lower 48 states. I have been here for about 2.5 years, and prior to this, I was at the national office. I worked at the Presbyterian Church, working in the Presbyterian Mission Agency, and there I oversaw the area of Christian formation, and this is what led me to be connected to, in part, to this curriculum. Hey folks, Jason Brian Santos here, back with another conversation piece around Sabbath. And this week we're going to look at what it means to make a glad descent from Sabbath. The concept of a glad descent comes from a neo-reformed theologian from Germany by the name of Karl Barth, who was a contemporary of Bonhoeffer around the time of World War II. And he developed his understanding of Sabbath as a celebratory, communal, relational time for the Christian church that is centered around the Lord's Day, or what we call Sunday worship, or that day that we say is after the day after Christ's resurrection was the Lord's Day, and that's when we celebrate his life that he's given us. And so in this sense of little Sabbath on every Sunday, the question becomes, how do we move from that experience into a regular week with a glad descent? In particular, particularly in a culture that says, oh, Mondays are horrible. There's T-shirts, there's mugs that capture this idea that going back to work or going back to your daily routine or doing whatever you normally do on a weekday, just sliding back into that away and out of the weekend is always this sort of painful experience. People talk about needing more coffee on Monday, or just sort of having a hard time waking up, and actually there are a lot more mistakes actually made on Monday mornings too, because people are tired and they're not really rested from the weekend. But when you think about it, that feels like going from Sabbath on a Sunday and the Lord's Day into a Monday and just feeling bad about life and about which is happening. And so the question is, how do you go from a Sabbath experience that would typically happen on a Sunday back into your work week with a glad descent? Karl Barth addresses this, and he describes Sabbath as communal and celebratory and festive, and very much so about the formation of the people and their identity, and very akin to what Abraham Joshua Heschel describes as a typical Jewish Sabbath. And for both of those theologians, there is a sense of leaving Sabbath or leaving these experiences with a greater sense of who you are and a greater sense of mission in the world. And I think that's where we sort of focus on the idea that if Sunday is a Sabbath experience, if you're gathering with your church community is this environment that feeds you and nurtures you and empowers you, and if your sense of Christian vocation is, yes, we're here on this earth to proclaim the gospel and to share and to show God's love in all that we do and say, then there is a sense of you're being filled up on Sunday, and that glad descent, as Barth describes it, is a way of imagining going back down a hill back into the mundane parts of life, but not in a sense of drudgery, like, oh, this is what I got to do, but knowing, first of all, that there's another Sabbath only 7 days away. But second of all, knowing that as we've been filled and we've been nurtured and we've been supported and given strength, and the Spirit has filled us in our experiences of Sabbath, that then we are then called to go back into the world. And I would go even as far as to say with Barth that it's not just about going back into the world with a cheery disposition, although that's nice too, but it's going back into the world with a sense of how do I carry on these Sabbath practices? How do I hold on to the things that defined and shaped me, and in some way experience those things throughout the week, and allow those things to really stir within my heart a compassion and a burden for others, in a sense of descending with gladness from Sabbath is not not just about continued sanctification, but also about engaging in acts of mercy and justice and love. In other words, we're being sent into the world, into a world that is hurting, who doesn't have an alternative way of living, who is lost in this consumeristic, marketing saturated world that where we're looked at as commodities, and we're the product that's being sold, and we're being sold to. And the more we pander to that, the more we get embraced by it. And we know that that's there, but if we've been filled with the Spirit and we go back into that, there's a sense of saying, how do I engage in this world through acts of justice and mercy and hope and love, and in doing so fulfill that calling that God has placed upon our lives? So that means we go back, and on a Tuesday we seek out ways to show God's love. We volunteer in places and ministries that serve the homeless, or who care for the widows and orphans, or who are seeking after those who are lost. And when we're doing so, we're honoring both the Sabbath and the spirit of what happened to us and the formation that we encountered in an experience of Sabbath. We're taking all of that and we're returning to the world with a greater sense of hope, a greater sense of love, and a greater sense of what Christ calls us to, and that we may proclaim the gospel in all that we do and say as we return. And then the beautiful part about that is that 7 days later, there's another Sabbath. And there's a chance to refill again. So it's not as if we have to go a month at a time and just rely on that one experience like we often do from a camp or a missions trip, where we have a spiritual high and we leave, and then 2 months later it dies. But no, we're meant to be in that sense of Sabbath experience, in that counter on a weekly basis, and with the knowledge that it'll come around again in another weekly cycle. But until then, that we're called to continue in our Christian formation, we're continue in our Christian discipleship, we're called to continue in those practices, and continue in the aspects of our lives that show mercy and justice and love to all those we encounter. As we end out this session, I hope that you have expanded your understanding of Sabbath and have been challenged by that understanding, and that as you move forward, as you approach a Sunday, you'll think, what should this Sunday mean to me and to my community? And hopefully that'll shape you as you move forward as a disciple of Christ. Blessings as you go.